It's so nice to be with you. Thank you for jumping in. We've been talking about COVID and all that kind of stuff for blimmin' what feels like an eternity. I just watched a little doco actually with you from, I think it was out in July with Loading Docs. They did a little 5-minute one on you or a 7-minute one on you. And the thing that freaked me out most of all watching that was there was a clip of a news item, and the news item talked about, that there'd been 34,000 cases of coronavirus around the world. And now, as I look at right now on my screen up here, I look at the worldmeters.info, 40 million. 40 million. And that's in a surprising short amount of time. Fairly terrifying.
Yeah. There's about 400,000 cases a day now around the world.
Wow.
I know.
That is terrifying. It is terrifying. But look, I also wanted to have a chat with you. We'll talk through the evening. We've invited people if they want to jump in and join on via Twitter or Facebook as well. But one of the things I really wanted to ask you about was your expertise in bioluminescence. Because is it the same bioluminescence that I used to see very occasionally when I was at a family batch in Mangawhai Heads in Northland in the water? Is that the bioluminescence we're talking about?
So that's a little bit different. That's phosphorescence, which is kind of little creatures that glow when they're agitated. So they have a kind of slightly different chemical reaction. Bioluminescence is, it's kind of, again, it's a chemical reaction that requires living cells to produce. But yeah, a different chemistry, basically.
Because you are a microbiologist, and
yes.
That has... It's kind of the sort of the face, I was going to say, the faces of coronavirus. That sounds horrible, doesn't it? I don't mean it like that. I mean, two of the experts that seem to be called on most of all are you and Michael Baker. And so what's the link? What's the microbiologist link to coronavirus? How is it you've become one of the kind of two preeminent voices within that science realm in New Zealand at the moment?
So I guess, my research interest is in infectious diseases, and while my research is primarily about bacteria, as a microbiologist, I understand viruses too. But I think one of the reasons I've been called on is because I've also spent the last 10 years sort of building up my ability to speak to journalists, to the public about science stories. So I've played this role in New Zealand before around, when there's microbiology things happening with our botulism scare with Fonterra, with Zika, with Ebola. What journalists know that I'm somebody who can explain science stories. And so I've often been asked to comment. And so that, to me, this one sort of started out just like all of those other ones have. A journalist gives me a call and says, hey, we've heard about this thing. Can you explain it to us? And I go and have a look at it and go, yep, I can explain that. But obviously this has turned into very, very different from all of the other, I guess, pandemics that I've been asked to explain, where this one has impacted on the entire world and has disrupted us in ways that we could never have imagined. So I would say it's sort of a both a research. I have the knowledge and expertise around infectious diseases, which encompasses viruses, but I've also spent a long time learning how to talk about these things to the general public and to journalists.
So the expertise in communication as well as microbiology. I often talk to performers, artists, people who have a significant starting point in their life, and I like to talk to them about what were you doing the day before. And an example is I talked to AJ Hackett earlier this year, and I was like, dude, tell me about the day before the first jump. What was that day like leading up? You knew it was coming, and then there was that event, which was the first jump, and then AJ Hackett was a part of this earth. That first time you looked up this coronavirus, the journalist connected with you, and they said, "Can you tell us about this?" And you looked it up. In that moment there, what did you think? Were you concerned straight away? And let's say from there, the subsequent 24, 48 hours, what did you go through?
So I, as a microbiologist who I've often not blogged and written about things too. I follow outbreaks around the world. And so I heard about this one in kind of, I guess it must have been early January, but I was actually on holiday with my daughter overseas. And so I heard about it, and what I would normally do is start reading up and seeing what information I can find. I usually go to the WHO website, I would go to the CDC in the US and see what reports I can find about it. But I was on holiday with my daughter. And so I basically, I guess at that stage we were in London and we were just having an absolute ball. And so I thought, no, I'm on holiday. I'm going to enjoy my holiday with my daughter. I'm not going to look this up until I get home, if it's still a thing. And then we got home something like the 15th of January. And by that weekend, my phone was starting to ring. And so I was like, okay, I better look this up. And so I did what I normally do, which was, to go to the WHO website, to go and read their situation reports, to start see what public information there is out there. And at that stage, it was concerning, but not hugely so. It was like, okay, there's a weird respiratory thing. There was at that stage no reports of healthcare workers and things, and so it was a okay, let's sort of watch and wait, and then 2 weeks later it was like, whoa, okay, this is escalating, and
wow,
probably a week after that it was like, wow, okay, this is really serious. So it accelerated quite quickly, I guess.
So rather than like a 24-hour period, you're saying it was between kind of the start of your investigations, within 2 weeks, you were like, holy crap, this is serious.
This is looking serious. Yeah. Again, still not clear whether what impact it was going to have. It looked serious, but whether it would turn into what it's turned into was still, I guess, not really clear at that stage. It was I guess a period, probably about 3 or 4 weeks, where it went from there's this thing I've heard about to wow, this is looking pretty serious.
And I think if people Google your name and they find that Loading Docs little documentary, I think it was for RNZ, if I'm correct, I'm sure they'll be able to find it. I think testament to the fact that you found it serious was when I nearly said Helen Clark, when Jacinda Ardern announced the level 4 in the documentary, you burst into tears. So it seems that was a weight that was on you, that you were like acknowledging that was, from your perspective, the right thing to do.
Yeah, because I guess the difficult thing when you have a little, when you have expert knowledge, kind of insider knowledge, I guess, is what's going to happen. So at that stage, it was very clear that if we didn't act quite drastically, things were going to get really, really tough here. Like, we were basically going to go down the route that other countries were going to go down, I guess. So maybe I should clarify that a little bit. So the problem is, so our government was clearly taking this very seriously. And the alarms were sounding. We could see what was happening in China. We could see what was happening in Italy. When the Chinese started building hospitals in a matter of days, and when the Italian doctors were having to make decisions over who got a ventilator, it was very clear that if we let happen to us what was happening there, we would not cope. And so what the difficulty was, our case numbers were really, really, really low, right? And so the question was, where were we on that exponential curve? Were we still really, really close to the beginning, or were we actually just a few days away from it going kind of wild? And so I knew that if our government were taking it as seriously as they seem to be taking it, that restrictions were coming. But the question is, when do you do them? Because if you do them too early, then you've kind of gone too early. And if you do them too late, then you've gone too late. And there's sort of there's a bit in the middle, which is not really, that you need to do it at some point then. And so that's where we were. We didn't know where we were on that curve. And so it was like, well, we've got to act soon, but we're not sure when. And I guess the thing that was really good about our response was that the government were putting together all of the financial stuff. So they didn't just go, right, shut down, everybody home. they put everything in place to allow people to stay home by putting in the wage subsidy and all those things. And that took, that took time. So that was sort of what was going on. And, I got to that stage. I mean, I wasn't sleeping very well. I was in some really weird kind of, it was almost like a sort of, my body had gone to this sort of fight or flight mode where wow. I was just sleeping 5 hours a night, which is not enough for me. And I was going to bed at midnight. I was like reading and writing and up until midnight. And then I would crash for 5 hours. And then I would be up again at 5, just like ping, ready to go, reading again, getting on top of what had happened overnight overseas. And within a few days of us going into alert level 4, I was sleeping again. Wow. Because I felt safe. I felt like, we were going to get on top of it. And then it's kind of been interesting coming out of that and going back into a little bit of panic mode around the election, because, there's no guarantee that if we had a change of government, we would stick with the same course of action. And that, given how everything's accelerating overseas, that really, really worried me. And so I went back into panic mode. Wasn't quite as bad as before, but it was certainly quite frightening, because what we saw, I guess what we've been saved by a little bit is having poor Victoria and Melbourne having the experience that they had, and having a little second outbreak here. And what we saw in Victoria is, if you wait even just a few weeks, you go from the kind of outbreak that we had second time around, where we peaked at maybe 20 cases a day, to peaking at nearly 800 or 900 cases a day. And like, that's just what a few weeks difference you get, right? You end up with thousands of cases rather than 100 or so. Yeah. And so I think seeing that, and everybody seeing, that's how how quickly you can go from just thinking everything's fine and you're going off to All Blacks matches, to everybody at home again and when concerned. I think that sort of helped a little bit to show what was still at stake. But now we have to we still have those kind of forces working, trying to push us open. And, we see what that leads to. I mean, that leads to deaths and sort of terrible outcomes, even for those who survive. And so it's going to be really hard to stay the course, I think. So I'm not sure whether I'm going to get properly back to sleeping again until this is all over. But I don't feel in the same state I was back in March.
I was going to ask you, and I do want to ask you, we'll get to it shortly, about the new government, and do you think that'll make a difference with the continuation? You kind of already touched on that, but I was going to say as well, that big outbreak when that happened in Victoria, I was thinking, but Australia is so much bigger than us. But actually, it was in Victoria, and Victoria is only about 7 million people, and New Zealand's 5 million. So actually, 20 cases a day versus 800 is actually, per capita, hugely disproportionate. So I think that's one of the things I've been doing as well. I keep not so much recently. It was interesting, that first lockdown, how everyone was tuning into the 1 o'clock news. I know everyone I know was checking the World Meters Info, website. Not so much doing that now, but the things I've been watching is the proportional information, the per capita information, because obviously, comparing us with 5 million to another country with 30 million, obviously they're going to have more cases. But it's been gratifying that even within the per capita, we are doing spectacularly well. And I think all credit goes to Jacinda Ardern and her team. And I know people who don't want to give Jacinda Ardern credit. They'll say, well, it's a team around her. Yeah, it is. But all leaders have got a team around them. And some leaders have chosen not to follow through on the team's information. So all credit to her. I feel like we have had a mix of good management and good luck. Our borders are lucky. I think the second outbreak in Auckland, if you can even call it an outbreak, but the mini outbreak or whatever it was, there was some good luck there, because obviously there were some holes on the border that luckily didn't end up being a worse place for entry and causing worse cases than actually happened. But in that first lockdown, that first 4 weeks, I've been a broadcaster for 20 years. I was working for news and current events radio stations when things like bird flu came through and swine flu came through, and they were topics of conversation. This felt different. This was, you say you weren't sleeping. I remember in Dunedin, obviously, I remember driving the streets of Dunedin to go and get some fresh fruit and veg, and all the streets being empty. Now, for people who live in bigger centres, they might go, well, it's always empty in Dunedin. But, again, comparatively, we have one-way systems in Dunedin that have 3 lanes one way, 3 lanes the other, not a car on any of them. And it was like, this is different. And then, of course, you see the pictures from Italy and from Venice and from New York where their streets are empty too. It just felt different to those other ones. And I think probably testament to 1.1 million deaths, 40 million people have got it around the world. That's the evidence that it has been different.
And the really sad thing is both of those numbers are underestimates.
Of course, yeah.
Some countries, I mean, the UK, for example, has a definition for counting something as a COVID death, and that is if the person dies within 28 days of testing positive. I mean, some people take several months to die. It's just, so that's one way to massage your figures, I guess. I mean, it's appalling. But if you look at, I think it's The Economist have been tracking the excess deaths around the world. Oh, we're about to be joined by a cat, I think.
Fantastic.
The door very slowly opens. Oh, there she comes.
Perfect.
If you check the places that are tracking those excess deaths, I mean, you can see this is not normal, right? This is not just a bad flu. This is something really, really different. And actually, one of the talks I've started giving is to try and explain to people why this is different, actually. That, when we think about influenza and things like that, we think about the other outbreaks that we've had or things that turned into near pandemics. Like imagine having a collection of dice in your hands, right? And one of those will be, some features about the virus, like how does it transmit, and when do people have symptoms, and what kind of symptoms do they have? There'll be another one that's sort of like, where in the world does it emerge and when? And it feels like with this one, we've kind of rolled almost the worst set of numbers. Because it emerged in a populous place at a time of the year everyone was moving around. People are infectious before they realize it. It's got symptoms that look like everything else. It's really, really different. It's not something like the influenza where we can make a vaccine really quickly. It's not like SARS where people had a very high fever and so it was easy to identify people and isolate them. This is really different. And so, the only thing that would have been worse was if it had a higher death rate than it has, but everything else has been pretty bad. And so I think when you start to understand that this is different, there's a reason why this is, there's a reason why we didn't lock down whole countries with the swine flu. This is very different, and stopping people, stopping that person-to-person transmission is how we have to deal with it. And the really sad thing is because there are so many countries that are not dealing with it, they put everybody else at risk. And so one thing I do want to make really clear, so the idea that all the measures that we could put around the border are impenetrable is not a correct one, right? No system is 100% bulletproof.
Yeah.
I think the thing that has been most impressive about New Zealand's response has been taking every, I'm not going to call them failures because they're not failures, everything that's happened, using it as a learning opportunity to say, right, how can we make this even stronger? And it's been that flexibility, that, adapting on the fly almost, because there is no handbook for this, right? The one that we had was for an entirely different virus, for an entirely different set of circumstances. What's really important is that, we have layers of defense, right? We have the testing of all the people working in the border, and we have the closures, and we have the managed isolation, but everything else that we do, using the app, washing our hands, they're all extra layers of protection. And when we layer all those things up, we prevent something like what happened to us in Auckland happening again, right? It's when we become complacent that we don't catch anything, or we catch it, but later. Yeah. The sooner we can catch things. And like has just happened, so in the last couple of days, we've got an incredible example where somebody, they're doing routine testing at borders and ports, somebody who's been testing negative gets symptoms, and the day they get symptoms, they call it in and they get tested and they end up being positive. They're isolated. And then there's basically that rapid, who have they been in contact with for the few days that they would have been infectious, isolate all of them. and then you very quickly bring something under control. And it's entirely dependent on everybody having that mindset of at any stage, even though we're on that elimination path and we don't feel like we don't have it here as far as we know, the minute you get any symptoms that could be COVID-19, it's absolutely paramount that you go, is it? I'm just going to make sure. I'm going to go and I'm going to get that test. And I'm not going to wait a few days. I'm going to do it right now, because if it ends up you're positive, the more days you wait, the more people you expose to the virus. And then you end up with more and more cases, right? So that's the thing that we'd missed between, I guess, the first outbreak and the Auckland cluster, was we'd become a little bit complacent. People were like, oh, and I know it's hard, right? When you've got something that could be hay fever or could be asthma, it's really hard. But that's the thing that we have to keep up. And it will mean that we don't have to move into, up the alert levels again if we keep up that really quickly go and get tested and make sure it's not COVID-19.
Yeah, I think I've already shared this story a couple of times on this podcast, so forgive me for people who have heard it. But I think that idea about us getting complacent, I'm an example of that. So the week before we went back into the Auckland changing of levels, there wasn't quite a lockdown, but the changing for that second round, I'd been sick with a cold. But one of the things I did was like, well, COVID's not in the country. It's obviously not COVID. And it wasn't. But then
it could have been.
Well, it could have been, yeah. But because I was complacent and there was a cold going around Dunedin, and so I didn't. I work from home. I'm a kind of isolated person a lot of the time, anyway. But I didn't do anything about it, which is also one of the reasons I didn't pile on for that person who travelled down to Bay of Plenty in the car, because I thought, well, if that had been me, I might have done that too, because I went, there's no cases in New Zealand, it's not COVID. But the learning thing, and this is the good management versus good luck, it's lucky that those of us who were complacent didn't cause another massive Victorian spike. Luckily, we didn't. But now, until vaccine or whatever the final solution is, it's going to be cold, test immediately, symptoms, test immediately, no matter whether it's in country or not. And that's, I'll put my hand up, my bad, but I think that little hiccup in Auckland was, I think, a wake-up call for some of us who were a bit complacent.
I mean, I hope so. I have seen less people using the app and various things like that, so that worries me a little bit, because it's very easy to do. It's very easy to, these are easy things, and we need to get into the mindset of doing them, because if that's how we will contain any potential outbreaks without having to move up the alert levels and and end up kind of in restrictions again. So it's kind of on all of us to play our part. And I think we have to remember that we got through this as a team by, everybody doing what they need to do. And this is it just carries on. And, but our teamwork now is keep washing your hands, go get tested, use the app, that type of thing.
Yeah, I used an analogy the other day. You were talking about all the layers of protection, the washing your hands, the app, all those things. I talked to someone and I said, it's a bit like a racing car driver. They don't just wear a helmet. They wear a helmet and they're in a 5-point harness, and they've got a fire suit on, and then they've got another suit over the top, and they're layered up to make them as protected as they can from whatever that potential outcome might be. And I thought that was just a way in my head that I kind of go, all these little things added up to more protection overall, which I quite like.
So there's a really cool model that's actually there's a name for this. It's called the Swiss cheese model. And so this is widely used in the aviation industry and in medicine and things. And so the idea is that every layer has potential holes in it. So it's like a slice of Swiss cheese. Obviously, there's lots of different types of Swiss cheese, some of which don't have holes in. But anyway, think of something like Emmental. And the idea is that if you layer them up, it's basically only if the holes align that you'll end up getting, an outbreak if we apply it to COVID, or you'll get a failure. And so the idea is that the more of those things we layer up, the less chance there is that you will end up having all the holes aligning, kind of thing. Yeah. And so that's what we have to think of, that there are layers of Swiss cheese that are the responsibility of the government, and there are layers of the Swiss cheese that are our responsibility. And it's by doing all of those things, everyone's collective responsibility, that we'll stay, safe and able to go to All Blacks matches and things like that.
can you explain to me, is there a way to explain that when people are most infectious? Like, is it when they're showing signs? Is it the days leading up to that? Is there any research? Because then there's also the gentleman who went through the 2 weeks of, I think it was a gentleman, went through 2 weeks of quarantine and then had a positive test after that. So there might not be a one-stop shop, but is there a general rule for where people are most infectious with this disease, this virus?
Yeah, so it's looking like it's at least 2 days, possibly 3 or so before their symptoms start, and then for a few days when their symptoms, after their symptoms have started. So they're probably infectious for a week or so, maybe a little bit longer, on either side of when their symptoms develop. So the case, that case of somebody who came through managed isolation was actually really interesting, because at first, so we do know that there are outliers in terms of this 14-day isolation period, where I think at the moment maybe the longest is about 24 days.
Wow.
Where somebody has incubated it for that long.
Wow.
And so that's what I thought when I heard about this case. It was like, oh, we've got one of these people who has incubated it for longer, and he did absolutely the right thing. As soon as his symptoms started, he called up and he was like, regardless of my negative tests, I've got these things. But actually, in that case, it turned out to be, it wasn't one of these long cases. He had become infected on the charter flight that was flying him from managed isolation back to his home in Auckland with someone else who'd been in through their 14 days. And that person was the one that was actually infectious, and they picked it up from somebody else in their managed isolation. So so it's this kind of, again, we can pick up these really unlikely and quite complicated transmission chains because we have no community transmission. So we're seeing all of the really sneaky ways this virus can transmit. So basically what happened was somebody tested positive in managed isolation and they were moved to the quarantine facility. But in the few days that they were infectious, they overlapped in the hotel with this person who tested negative. That person tested negative on their second test, but they were basically incubating. They got on a plane and then they gave it to this other person, and that person was the person who tested positive first. So it's like, anyway, so it's just, there's still so much we don't know about, how infectious are people who have really mild symptoms or no symptoms at all. I mean, there's just still so much to learn. But one of the things that that New Zealand can actually contribute is some important information about transmission, because we are seeing things that other countries just can't even notice because they've got so many cases, like this transmission from a dustbin.
Wow.
What else have we had? The lift button, all of these things, and all of it shows just how tricky this virus is and why we made the right call going down the path that we did.
It sounds like a game of Cluedo, Mr. Mustard touched the candlestick in the den. You know what I mean? It's like there's like 7 steps to get there, and then you find out how they actually got it.
But what's also really important is that we shouldn't take, this is a sneaky virus. It does transmit in all of these ways. I don't want anyone to give up. We know the ways to stop transmission. New Zealand has proved it. There are other countries like us that have done a really great job. Loads of countries in Africa are doing a fantastic job because they've just been dealing with, the Ebola outbreak over the last few years. So their infection, control methods are also fantastic. So there are countries that are doing an incredible job. They're really good examples to the rest of the world of all of the different layers you can use. And different countries are using slightly different combinations of layers, slices of Swiss cheese. It's the countries that aren't using any that are the ones that are putting the rest of us at risk, and their own citizens. And that's, I think, what's heartbreaking is, it's heartbreaking.
You can just say it. You can just say USA. You don't have to be nice and kind of play beat around.
UK. I mean, I'm originally from the UK. My parents are over there. That's where we were in January, catching up with my parents. I'm really glad we did that, because goodness knows when we're going to see them again. But my mum is vulnerable. She has an underlying health condition. She and my dad have been isolated since February.
Wow,
that's a long time.
It's a long time.
Since February, they have not seen anyone else, and they're not going to see anyone else because the UK is back on its upward trajectory. And so, gosh, I mean, if we thought our 4 weeks was bad. What about those countries where people have been isolated for months? And the saddest thing is that my parents are in a privileged position. They are retired. They can stay at home. The thing that this virus is showing us is that those communities that have always been more at risk from all sorts of things are the ones who are bearing the brunt. Those people who cannot, who are not privileged enough to be able to isolate, they are the ones who are getting really sick. And so it's just showing all of the inequities that we have in this world. And it's just, it's unethical and awful what's happening.
I hope that, and what I feel for me, I hope that we understand the privileged position we're in New Zealand. And it's privileged, although sometimes you hear the word privilege, and you hear about, various forms of privilege, and often privilege comes with nothing you've done to earn that. Whereas I think we've done something to earn this privilege, the whole team of 5 million that we're talking about in a government that took action. But I still feel maybe lucky would be a better word, because there's no reason I should be in New Zealand other than luck, But the privileged or lucky position that we're in right now, and I watched the All Blacks at Eden Park yesterday, and I think I hope the people in those stands are going, in their heads they're going, I need to stay on top of these things, the washing the hands, this, that if I'm feeling sick, get a test so I can keep doing this. They're not seeing that they're not using that as a thing of complacency. In other words, everything's okay now because we're back at the rugby. So we're either back at the rugby and everything's okay now, or we're back at the rugby needing to acknowledge this is a real privilege, and for us to keep this privilege, we need to stay on top of this thing. I hope they do it that way. I hope, like me, which is what I'm trying to do at the moment, I'm sort of trying to stay living in level 2 a little bit. Like still doing some of those things in level 2, not being like religious about it, but just some of those things that are hoping to keep the people around me safer should something come back in.
Yeah, I think there's a few things that I think people need to get their heads around. So the first is that the world is forever changed from this. And there is no going back to how our lives were in 2019. And the sooner we get our heads around that, the better. Then there's it's incredible to be in the safe position that we're in, that we know that it's come with some hefty, downsides. We do know that there are going to be many industries that this is going to be really hard for. But the answer is not to just throw up our hands and say, well, for the sake of those industries, we need to experience what everyone else is experiencing, right? The world is going into a global recession. Those countries that have huge numbers of deaths, because they've kept their economies open, have had the same issues that we've had, economically. So we're having, it's hard on our economy, but we haven't got all the dead people, which are also part of our economy and our fellow citizens, and I think the real issue is also going to be for those countries that have kind of just let it rip and continue to let it rip, what they're also setting themselves up for in the future, because we know that there's, it's really likely that people are going to be left with long-term health issues from this virus, and that's not going to come without a cost, right? Both to their quality of life, but also actually to the health systems, and the impact it's having on health systems. The fact that in many countries now they're having to stop routine operations and things, and although we had to do that for a little bit, we will catch up. We will get those things back again. And so, it's the end of an era. And I guess but the positive stuff is that what we've shown is that we can act really fast and quite dramatically if we need to. And the reality is that we face lots of challenges already. Climate change, there will be more pandemics. The question is, how do we go forward from here? What's the kind of society that we rebuild? How do we rebuild our economy to make us more resilient to those things that we know are coming? So that we don't end up in experiencing something quite like this again, that we make ourselves a little bit more able to ride the waves that we know are coming. And so I think there's no excuses anymore for saying, this is too hard. It's like, nah, we've shown you can do hard, right? And you can do it. You can make drastic changes quite quickly. And so the question is, what are we ready to What are we ready to change to make sure that we can weather the next storm in a much better position?
And I wonder, I mean, you think about the death rate that's gone down in places like rest homes because little Johnny's not coming in with his cold or his flu and wiping out half of the 85, 90-year-olds, and we seem to be showing better care of when we go to other spaces that aren't our own for washing our hands and not going if we've got a cold. Those sorts of things continue on, then I think that's some of the I don't like thinking about like it's a good outcome, but it's a positive byproduct, if we can put it that way, from what we're going through.
Our death rate did go down, and it wasn't just in the elderly. There were less premature babies born. There were all sorts of things. Perhaps the fact that many pregnant women were at home in that final, in those final months and weeks of pregnancy actually had an impact on their babies. So we saw pollution going down. We saw all sorts of changes.
Yeah,
and
fewer car accidents.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So just shows how important these things are, and that maybe the world that we had built for ourselves is not a great world.
I think one of the other potential positive byproducts that'll come from this. So I'm in my house right now. I had a studio in central Dunedin, and I've bought it home. And I think for a long time, since the age of the internet got workable, that we can have decent speeds at home, and obviously that's easily what we've got now. I feel like the Western world's been saying, we could work from home if we wanted to. We could work from home. We've never done it. Whereas now we've been forced to do it. I imagine that there'll be companies out there going, why the hell are we spending $10 million a year on this building when we can have a much smaller building, have our people work remotely, maybe increase their salaries a bit? I think that we've proven the model works for some businesses. One of the saddest things about this, well, maybe not one of the saddest, but a sad thing about this current thing is the disparity in who is finding it toughest. The people who are in the lower paid employments are the ones that are getting hit harder than those in the higher paid employments, because accountants can work from home. People who work in an office can work from home. Someone who serves burgers can't. So there's that to figure out, but there is going to be a sector of society who now it's been proven you don't have to necessarily get into your metal box for an hour a day and drive down the motorway, because we've proved the model works of working remotely and working from home.
Which, of course, is something that disability advocates have been yelling about for a long time, right? So, it's going to open access for all sorts of people into all sorts of jobs. I think, again, there's now no excuse to say that, accessibility is going to be an issue. But you're absolutely right. Again, it's shown privilege. And I think one of the most confronting things for all of us, or it should have been confronting, was when we went into alert level 4, who our essential workers were. They are the ones who are low paid and everything. And so we really need to do something about that. They really should be, and this is where I'm going to show all my liberal strikes, but there should be a living wage and all these kinds of things. That in no way should we be living in a society where people are working full time and not earning enough money to make ends meet. It's appalling, absolutely appalling. And again, it makes us, not only does it make those communities vulnerable, it makes all of us vulnerable. So why would we not want to fix stuff like that?
Yeah, no, I agree with you. And I think there's kind of a two-pronged attack. And I've seen graphs. I was just looking for one while we were talking to see if I could bring it up, but I couldn't find one quickly. But there were graphs of all the other kind of, where the economy's been hit and the wealthy were here and everyone else was below, and the graphs were kind of the same all the way through. Whereas this time what's happened is the wealthy have stayed where they were, all gone up, and the people who are paid less have dropped right away. So the gap between them is a lot more now than it was. So there is those. We now address the idea of working remotely, but also address what happens, as you say, with people who are living below the poverty line, around the poverty line, who are underemployed, who don't have a living wage. That needs to be a part of the conversation as well. And perhaps saving all that money in the economy on things like buildings, maybe money can be used smartly in other areas to, I don't mean literally support, from that business to that person, but used more wisely in our economy to support a living wage.
Yeah.
I was going to ask you, could you, I'm sure you've done the research on it, could you explain or can you give us a bit of a heads up on what's happening at the ports at the moment? It seems, I was watching One News tonight, that it seems that there was an international sailor, international worker, come through our isolation period for a few days. Obviously, they weren't going into the community, so they left them out earlier, gone to the boats, and that's where there's a bit of a community issue at the moment amongst an international worker and a couple of people that were around him or her. Is that correct?
So the case that was announced on Sunday is a port worker who, for their job, some kind of maintenance where they go onto boats for longer periods of time. So over the last 2 weeks, they've been on 2 boats, one of which I think is a boat that's in New Zealand waters with the New Zealand crew, but the other one was an international boat, which is now, I believe, on its way to Australia or something.
Yeah.
So, and these workers use protective equipment. They wear masks and they use gloves and everything. Anyway, so it looks like that port worker got the infection from working on probably that boat rather than any other boat. And so the strain that they've got has been sequenced. It's not one that's related to, it's not one we've had in New Zealand. It's not one related to the Auckland cluster. So it's something kind of different. And as a precaution, they have been testing. So this person had also worked on this New Zealand boat more recently, probably too recently for it to have been the source. And again, it was a New Zealand boat operating in New Zealand waters with a New Zealand crew. But they've all been tested and I think are being kept away from everybody else. But I think in the process of doing some further testing, so they've been testing, other, I think there was maybe, there's been another boat or something. Basically, in the testing of all the boats and people on the boats and all that kind of stuff, somebody has tested positive, and it looks like it's a historic infection. So it's not related to this cluster. It's just somebody who's tested positive, who had tested negative in the past, but has tested positive now. And that's because we know that people can test positive for the virus many, many weeks after they've had an infection.
So that means they won't be infectious, but they've still got the dead virus in their body.
Yes. So this PCR test picks up very small fragments of virus. And so you can have fragments of virus circulating around your body weeks after your body has basically got rid of it all. There's been some really good studies, I think in South Korea, where they took people who were still testing positive, 2 months later, and they tried to get live or they tried to get virus out of those samples and showed that none of them were able to infect cells. So there's nothing alive in there. It's just... Okay. It's just these fragments.
And so if we hear that term, it's a historic case. That means it's a case that was infectious in the history back in the past. But if they use the term historic case, it means that even though they've tested positive, that person is not infectious.
Yeah, they are not infectious. Yeah, they're well past their infectious stage. Yeah. And so this is a few other cases have popped up this way where somebody has, had some symptoms, gone to get tested. Their test has been positive, but it turns out that it's not COVID-19 now. They actually had COVID-19 months ago. And I think there was somebody else quite recently. It was they'd maybe come from overseas and they'd had it already overseas, and then the test was popping up positive again. And again, the way the test is done, so it's basically the faster the test becomes positive when they do the test, that means the more viral fragments there are or the more viruses around. So somebody with a historic infection is one where the test takes a long time. It goes through all its cycles to become positive. Whereas if somebody is infectious or it's a very new infection, then they test positive quite quickly in terms of how long the actual test takes to run. And so when they get these cases where the test positive, but it takes a long time to test positive, that's when they go back and they go, is this someone right at the beginning of their infection, or is this somebody, who's basically this historic infection? So they take into account Where have they come from? Have they had symptoms before? All of those kinds of things. The other thing they can also do is take blood from that person and look for antibodies, which is the body's response to infection. And so somebody who's just got an infection won't have those antibodies, whereas somebody who's had an infection in the past, they will have those, or if they have antibodies, it will be because their infection was in the past. And so again, that gives them another, oh yeah, okay, we found antibodies. This is suggesting, again, this historic infection. So it's a whole bunch of things that get done, from the sequencing, from the when does the test become positive, to looking at their blood to be able to then say, this is a case now, or this is somebody who's no longer infectious. They were a case weeks or months ago.
How do you feel about I learned tonight about the managed isolation for international workers? If they're not staying in the community, they can be in there for a short amount of time. Like I think some of the workers for the boats were in there for 4 days and then went straight to the boats. They haven't come into the community, but they also were in isolated management for very long. It seems like, I think I saw Michael Baker on the news tonight being maybe not that stoked about that, thinking that everyone should be 2 weeks no matter what. Do you have a view on that?
Well, it depends whether the managed isolation and quarantine is all about making sure people go the distance before they come into New Zealand and are with us. So if this is somebody who's come into the country, but they're going back out again, then what you want is them not being with us unless they've done their 2 weeks. But if they're leaving before 2 weeks, then as long as they're isolated away from us in that time, then that's what's important, is they're isolated from us and then they leave again. I guess the question will be, in what capacity are they leaving? Who are they leaving with? So when it's, boats and stuff, that's kind of one thing, because it's often the crew come together and then they maybe go together, and maybe on planes that will be a little different.
Yeah.
Who are they transiting with, I guess?
I think this is the longest I've had a podcast of recent weeks that I haven't mentioned politics, and I want to mention politics right now, as in the election, because of course it was a pretty amazing election, and I think that a lot of what we've been talking about tonight, and a lot of what we saw, under Jacinda Ardern, Labour instigate for the country for COVID, was reflected with a 63% of the voters voted for either the Labour or Greens, a left-wing government, and I think, was that the right number? Anyway, it was 60-ish%.
Something like that.
Something like that. I spoke to Rob Fife during the lockdown. He was one of the podcasts I did, and Rob Fife is a well-known businessman and former CEO of Air New Zealand, and most people would probably think, I don't know his politics, so I'm not saying it is, but most people would probably think of someone like that as being maybe a natural ally for someone like a National Party. But I asked, and I'll say again clearly, I don't know his politics. I could be completely wrong, but I asked him about the idea of what would be best, because he was involved with the COVID group to talk about business, what's happening with business and COVID and the government, and he was equivocal about it. He said, unequivocal is the right word, he had no doubt in what he was saying, which was there shouldn't be a change of government. A change of government would be potentially detrimental to the COVID response. What did you say about that?
Yeah, what I wanted was reassurance that we were sticking on the same path, that elimination was the way, elimination is the way to go. The more countries do that, the quicker we'll be out of this. And so that was what I was hoping for. And, during the leaders' debates, Jacinda Ardern was very clear. She was very clear this is the path that she was taking. Whereas Judith Collins was just not very clear about that, and from everything she had said in the past around the kind of measures they would put in place, essentially what it felt like is, if we think of the Swiss cheese, that everything she had proposed was about removing slices of cheese. And that just made me very nervous that we would then not follow the elimination path. We might go the way other countries have gone. And so, that's why I was just like, I don't want a change. If the pledge had been by National that they were going to stick the same course, then that would, that's a different matter. But one of the things I found quite difficult is they didn't seem to want to engage with the same group of experts that have basically been engaging with the government. So, several of us reached out several times, so, very happy to explain anything that, stuff we're talking to the government about or anybody else. And so, but we were told like they have their own experts who we weren't told who they were.
Right.
And so, all I wanted was a government that would stay the course, because the last thing I felt we needed was a change of strategy that would put us at risk.
I think it's interesting that you've just said very clearly elimination was the best path, because there was some confusion. I think last week, I'm going to bring up a little quote, a tweet that you put out around the WHO that looked like that. WHO, obviously, I can look at an organisation like them and say they've been learning along the way as well. So, of course, they're going to come out saying on day 1 we think this, on day 12 we think this, on day 50 we think this, because they're learning as they go. But it seems in recent times there was a statement made about maybe lockdowns weren't the best way to go from here forward. I wasn't entirely sure on what they'd said about that, but I want to bring up a tweet you put out about that, which I can do here. And you said, disappointed with this reporting by Newsub, told journalist I didn't have time to talk and hadn't heard about the Nabarro quote, but suspected it wasn't relevant to New Zealand given what he'd previously said about New Zealand. Asked the journo to find someone else. They published me anyway. And they'd said, oh no, did you know that? The tweet,
taken it off.
They've taken it off. The tweet no longer exists. So there you go. There's a little win for you.
Yeah.
So because you're still saying elimination, you personally, but it sounds like the WHO is not talking about elimination.
No.
Or have I missed something?
Yeah. Okay. So there's there's some quite important bits missing here. So the first is that the word lockdown is inappropriate because it's being used to describe lots of different things. So when we think of, what we went through at Alert Level 4 was a form of lockdown, right? There are other countries who have used stricter measures, so strict lockdowns like we had, without putting any financial things in place. So obviously it's very hard for people to stay at home if they actually can't afford to stay at home, right? Or if they're, if they're actually not getting any wages at all. And then there are other countries that are using this word lockdown, and there's almost no restrictions at all. Like there's weird restrictions, and so when there's been some people who've basically done some pretty poor research that say, those countries or those states that have used lockdowns basically don't fare any better. It's absolutely nonsense, but it entirely depends on your definition of lockdown. What's very clear, though, is that lockdowns or restricting movements are very blunt tools, and they can be very destructive, right? Especially if used badly. So the WHO have always said that they are not a tool, they don't agree that they are a tool that should be used all the time. They should be used if your health system is collapsing, or if you need to shore up the other things we know work really well, like access to testing, contact tracing, and isolation of infectious people and their contacts, right? That is the way that you stop outbreaks, like we have done with a couple of ours, right? What has happened was so that is their stance. Their stance is they are a blunt tool to really only be used in certain contexts. Please use all of the other tools that we have, all of the other slices of cheese, right? What happened was somebody who works for the WHO did a very long interview and basically, kind of reiterated this point, how they are essentially a blunt tool, and so, don't use them, or don't use them unless necessary, and was kind of taken out of context. And so I was kind of annoyed because I'd heard he's done interviews before where he has talked about how New Zealand is a shining example of how to deal with COVID, right? Of using the lockdowns, our particular restrictions, in order to buy time to, make sure we had a testing and contact tracing system that was fit for purpose, those kinds of things. And so then he obviously did this long interview and basically was talking about the UK, was talking to a UK magazine or newspaper about the UK, and it was kind of taken all out of context, and then became New Zealand shouldn't be doing the kinds of things New Zealand is doing. And so when the journalist called me, I said, look, I haven't heard his latest quotes. It would surprise me if it had any relevance to New Zealand, because the WHO have come out very clearly in support of our approach. we are a shining example, right? And then, I got basically, Siouxsie Wiles says it's irrelevant, and then loads of people piled on, and it's like, well, and it turned out, of course, it was irrelevant. They didn't mean us. And
I think I think within a couple of days, it also said, I wasn't talking about New Zealand. But it's I don't know if you feel that it's a good thing, but it's quite nice, I think, to see that News Hub's taking that down. So there's an acknowledgement there that they got that wrong, wasn't it?
Yeah, and I did get a call from the journalist, very apologetic that he had put it up. He was like, I didn't realize you didn't mean you didn't want to be quoted. I was like, well, how do you think it looks when a woman who's already getting harassed online says, I didn't read the comment, but here's my, I didn't read the piece, but here's my comment anyway. So he was like, oh yeah, you're right.
Are you okay to chat for a little bit longer? I've got a few more things. Are we all right? Do you want to get a beer or something, or a wine while we're having a chat? Hey, I was wondering, actually, it's kind of a half step back, but where do these things come from? Like, where has this thing been for the last 1,000 years? Where was AIDS prior to 1980? Are they in our world somewhere hidden away and they pop out? Or are these things, I don't know, generating themselves into our lives as we go through? Are there another 1,000 of these sort of viruses hidden away in different parts of the world that we may come across one day? But where do they actually come from?
Yeah, so I guess microorganisms like us evolve. They can do it much faster than we can because they have faster life cycles and they reach larger numbers. And so this evolution is happening out in the wild, in whatever hosts they have. We know, for example, that bats are an amazing kind of training ground for viruses. So one of the incredible things about bats is they fly. They're flying mammals, and that means they're very hot. They've got a very high body temperature. And so any virus that can survive in a bat can basically fend off a fever, which is one of the main ways that our bodies try and get rid of viruses. So, there are bats that are basically have viruses and those viruses are kind of evolving. And this happens also when, oh, hello. Sorry, we're being raided.
No, it's fine.
So we know that these things are out there in their environments, doing their thing, evolving, infecting hosts, be they bats or other hosts, and so there could be 1 million viruses that are capable of killing us in the blink of an eye out there. What we're seeing is when we encroach on other creatures' habitats, we and our domesticated animals are more likely to come into contact with them. And so it's kind of our human condition, I guess, our degrading of other animals' habitats, our moving our pigs and other animals into those habitats, where there's more likely to be this crossover from, a bat, for example, a virus in that getting into an animal that we are more likely to come into contact with. So these things happen. That's why we have whole bunches of scientists whose jobs are to go out and just see what viruses they can find, to sort of have some idea about what might be coming. But it's why we need to build our world to be both more resilient, but also to stop doing some of the stuff that we know leads to these kinds of what we call spillover events, really.
Yeah. Wow. That's interesting. And it's interesting that you mentioned bats, because obviously, is that why that's the go-to? Like we hear about, that's often the place that these viruses in the news, it could have come from a bat. It could have come from someone eating a bat. It could have come from someone being bitten by a bat, because they're such good hosts to allow these things to generate into something new.
Yeah, because often the viruses don't have an impact on the bats, right. So they just carry them. So Ebola is one of those, and it's not until you come in contact. I mean, sometimes it does make them sick, so it's maybe coming in contact with a bat, or it's eating a bat. Or it's a bat, coming into contact with our animals that then ends up with these sort of jumps in species.
How likely are we? I'm thinking about the vaccine, right? And the conversations that we've had, and as you'll appreciate, I've done probably 50 podcasts since March, and probably 45 of them at some stage, even if we're talking to someone not related to it, we've talked about COVID because it's taken over the world. And one of the common things that's been said is at the end of this, whether the end of this is a vaccine and we can get on top of it like we sort of did polio, or whether this is here forever and we learn to stay, or whether this is COVID-19 and next year there'll be a COVID-20 and the year after that there'll be a COVID-21. Of those sorts of ideas, are you, from a scientific point of view, do you think that there's a more likely outcome? Are you hopeful for a more likely outcome? Is it likely that we'll get a vaccine and that'll be sort of the back of this COVID-19 crisis? Do we know anything more?
Well, gosh, so there are 170 something vaccine candidates, you know, in some stage of development. I think we're now up to 11 that are maybe in stage phase 3 trials. So it does feel like, you know, we could get a vaccine. I mean, the important thing about this is it takes time, right? So it's the how do you deal with it until that comes. So I would hope for this kind of virus will be found. I guess the question is that going to be enough to get rid of COVID-19? And that will largely depend on how many people take it, but also how available one is. So one of the things that's been disturbing has been seeing countries kind of try to get all protectionist. We want this vaccine, but nobody else, right? And in response to that, what's been fabulous is that several companies have handed over, essentially allowed their vaccine candidates to be put into a portfolio. And that portfolio is being supported by multiple countries. So one of the ones that we're involved in is called COVAX. And it's basically a kind of lots of countries that can afford to put in money for a certain number of doses. And you pool all those resources to push forward both the testing, but also the manufacture of a range of vaccine candidates. And what it allows is access to countries that wouldn't be able to compete in an open market. So all of our Pacific neighbors would not be able to afford to get a vaccine in the open market. We may be okay. We might have to mortgage our country for it. You know, if it becomes an open market, you would end up with really rich countries saying, we want all of it. And so what's really great, and there is a little bit of that going on with some vaccine candidates. With this kind of thing, there are companies who are behaving responsibly. They're saying, you know, we obviously want to make our money back and then some, but not at the, you know, not so that we don't actually have, you know, everybody's dead and can't take a vaccine, right? So by countries putting their money in, we both secure doses for us, but also secure doses for those countries that couldn't afford it. And that's the way it has to be. It has to be equitable, because otherwise we can't, you know, as I say, we're all at risk, if, you know, with this. And, you know, and because there will be people in our communities, I mean, depending on what vaccines end up being successful, there may well be people who cannot be vaccinated because it's not safe for them. So whether that's because they're older or whether it's because they're really young or they have some underlying health conditions. And so what it needs is both the reduction in cases, but also a safe vaccine that, you know, as many of us as possible can take. And I guess the worry is there's a huge machine now that's in play that will be starting to push the anti-vaccination agenda. And so how many people will fall for that? How many people will say, I don't want a vaccine? Because the more of them there are, the more vulnerable it makes us. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. It's not the herd mentality like we're hearing about, you know, now, but it's, what do they say, 92% of the population or something needs to be vaccinated for the population to be covered, like when you're talking about polio.
Yeah, so we don't actually know what that percentage is for this virus. So for something like measles, it has to be very high. Basically everybody who can possibly get vaccinated for measles needs to be vaccinated to protect those who can't be. It may well be less, but we don't know. This is one of the problems. And one of the big issues again, is still an unknown, is how long people how long a vaccine might be effective for. There are some vaccines like you have to get vaccinated every year, or somewhere your immunity wanes over time, and so you'd need a booster. And so there's so many questions we don't know the answers to, which is why pinning our hopes on a vaccine and just saying bugger it until we get there is also not the strategy, right? It's why we need to reduce the burden of the disease everywhere, with the idea then that a vaccine could essentially mop up the rest. But we know, stop human to human transmission, you stop the virus. And this is something we can do right now. We don't need to, we don't need to wait for us to have a vaccine.
From the look at this virus and what it actually is there a very high chance that there will be, like how there's a new strain of flu every year? I'm not comparing it to the flu. I want to make that very clear. But how there's a new strain of flu every year. Is there a chance that there will be new COVIDs that come along from this one as it evolves into a different strain that maybe, much like the flu, there might have to be vaccines every year?
So at the moment, it's not looking like it. I guess the important thing to say about flu is that it's several species of virus. And then within those species, there are lots of subtypes. They mutate super fast. And that's a virus that also infects lots of other species than humans. So pigs, birds, all sorts of things. And what happens with flu, so the reason we end up with new flu strains every year and need a new vaccine is because every year around the world, this virus is infecting humans and birds and everything else. And they also, the same strains can infect us and pigs or us and birds. And so we can end up with our cells being infected with, at the same time, a single cell being infected with a flu from birds and a flu from humans. And then those two mix and match together and they create a new strain. So every year this happens all around the world. And it means that every year new strains emerge. And so we have to then say, right, what looks like it's becoming the dominant ones, and those are the ones we make vaccines for. This virus is not the same. So it doesn't have the same number of subtypes. It doesn't do that same thing. It doesn't seem to have, as far as we're aware, the same number of other species it can infect. The only thing that will make it us need a new vaccine is if it does undergo mutations that affect the protein that our body recognizes.
Right.
And if it does that to such an extent that our body no longer recognizes it, and then we need a new vaccine. So the things that are being developed at the moment, some of the strategies, it would be once we know they work and we know what it is that our body sees and how to make it react, it should be relatively easy to remake that to basically impact on a new strain. But it doesn't at the moment look like that's going to be a big issue. The more the issue is, do we generate protective antibodies, or can we make our body respond in a way that protects from the actual virus?
Someone's asked on Facebook, why is the common cold still around? When we went through lockdown and everyone was kind of over it, after lockdown, shouldn't the lockdown have eradicated that as well as COVID-19? And then I guess you'd also add to that, and if people are isolating for 2 weeks when they come to the country, shouldn't that be enough time to eradicate the common cold as well? So why is the cold still here?
So I guess the cold is about 400 different viruses. And again, some of them mutate quite fast, some of them don't. So no, we did not get rid of all of them. But
right.
We have seen a huge drop. And so actually, so there are some that have, we haven't seen many of. And with flu, flu moves around the world basically from people moving around. And so, we completely smashed the flu season this year. But obviously that virus is still circulating around in other animals. Same with colds. As I say, there are like 400 different species. So, and some of those presumably are shared with other animals and stuff. It would be nice if we got rid of them. But, being more mindful of washing our hands, being more mindful of staying home when we're sick rather than going to work or, sending kids to school. Those are the kinds of things that will dramatically impact on our colds as well.
All right. Hey, listen, very last question. And this question might be this might be my naivety and wide-eyed hope and desire for the world. But I was wondering if you would like to share something. Imagine you're talking to some of these people around the world, but in my head I see Americans who are about to come back into winter, who are about to come back into their flu season, apart from anything else, who seem fairly obvious that they've got a madman running the country who is only concerned about trying to get re-elected at the cost of the lives of the citizens in the country due to COVID-19. If you were to have a group of those people, can say the same, maybe not quite the same maniac running the UK, but whatever. What would you want to say? Let's say there was a dining room, or there was a lounge full of people watching this right now, sitting in the Midwest in America, going, COVID, it's no different from the flu, yada yada yada. What would you want to say to them?
Gosh, well, I mean, it's not the flu. It's really serious. That you don't have to live the way you're living. I mean, there are other ways you can stop the transmission of this virus. What it requires is leadership. And so, people need to vote for real leadership. And I guess the one thing I will say, so what we know from all of the research around changing people's minds is it's not me, I can't change people's minds. We are influenced more by the people we love and respect. And so those people, if there is somebody in your life who, doesn't believe this is an issue, or, it's the job of everyone around them to try and convince them. It's not my job. So, or I would love to, but I can't help. So it's my job to make sure that those people have access to all the right information, and that they can use that to help try to understand where, I guess, their loved one is coming from. And often you need to connect on a kind of a shared, what is it somebody's worried about? Why are they voting for a particular person? Why do they believe a certain thing? And trying to address that. Right, do not just give them a whole load of facts, because that won't work. But I guess my message is it's going to get worse before it gets better, but you can stop it. And it requires people to work together, and it requires good leadership. And so try and make that happen.
Lovely. Hey, I see that was the last thing I was going to ask you, but I do have one little thing that I've been meaning to. I've put this out there 2 or 3 times on Twitter, asking for someone to help me out with this. Let me just bring up this page. It's the people have been talking about the death rate of COVID, and they've been saying it's less than 1%. It's less than 1%. All I wanted to know, and maybe you can help, is if I have a look at America right now, the USA has had 8.3 million cases, 224,000 deaths. 224,000 deaths out of 8.3 million cases is about 2.5% death rate. What is the death rate 2.5%? Is it under 1%? What actually is it?
So I guess that's a hard question to answer, because it is so we know that both numbers are not accurate. We know this globally. We know this in most countries. We also know that the people who are likely to die are, it's not the same for everyone. So there are differences in age. And then there are also differences in, like, if you're a man, or if you're a smoker, if you have underlying things like diabetes and stuff. So for every country, you kind of need to look at what the structure of your population is like, who's likely to be at risk, and then try and make some calculations based on that. So for New Zealand, we reckon it would be about 1% for us of our population if we got it. For other countries where maybe they have a younger population and they don't have they don't have huge numbers of people with diabetes, it would be different. The important thing is, though, it's not just about death. That actually, even those people who survive, can end up with months and months of symptoms. And we think it's highly likely that this is going to cause, huge health issues for lots of people in the future. So it's not just this death rate. I mean, from the evidence, it looks like it is more deadly than flu, definitely. How much more deadly is not quite clear. But we also know for flu, we have vaccines. We know that we can protect a lot of people from flu. So again, that's not a good comparison to use either. The important thing is this is a virus we've never seen before. Most people are vulnerable, and lots of people, if they get it, will die, which is what we're seeing. And those that don't may end up, with health issues for the rest of their life. And all of that is completely avoidable by stopping the transmission of this virus between people.
Yeah, I heard a terrifying story about I think it was a woman in her 20s in America who got COVID, and it basically munted her lungs so much that once COVID was out of her system and stuff, she had a lung transplant.
Right.
So I know that's anecdotal. It's one thing, but yeah, it was pretty terrifying.
Well, and the really sad thing is there is now a movement around the world. I mean, it's sort of taking it's almost like taking its lessons from the sort of tobacco industry and fossil fuel industry, where they're trying to basically say there's sort of two sides to the story, right? They have found a small number of prestigious professors at Oxford and Harvard or Stanford or wherever, who back this idea of just allowing the virus to run through. Yes, people will die, but hopefully you could protect them, you protect the most vulnerable, and then it will be fine. And there's just no evidence that that strategy will actually work. It's inhumane, it's unethical, and more experts are on the other side, which is you can't do that. You need to try and stop it. And yeah, it's just really sad that people use this kind of like, oh, it's just like the flu, or it's not that deadly, or, it's only if you're old, that somehow we can magically protect, older people or anybody else. I mean, you just can't. You cannot take, again, for New Zealand, it would be like taking a quarter of our population and just putting them away somewhere. I mean, that just is not, it's not workable. It's not ethical. And there's another way, which is all the things we know work.
When it first came out in March, it's like a record release, isn't it? When we first knew of it, when it was locked down, the Otago University had a slogan which was "Do it for your nana and pop," and I thought that was quite a cool way of trying to get these young people, who then went off and had a party with 500 people, unfortunately. But the idea of thinking about not taking this home. This, like the schools in America, it's not about the students necessarily. It's about the teachers or the parents or grandparents at home. It's looking after those vulnerable people, and you might be fine, but how would you? I mean, like that tragic story of the Auckland outbreak about the two brothers who died. One took it to the other, and it's devastating. It's horror. It's just horrific. Hey, look, we've had you for too long, and even though he made a lovely appearance on our show, Stephen did. Thank him for lending you to us for a wee while. I want to say, if people want to find out more about you, do a bit of your writing. Spin-Off is a great place to go, and there is a lot of writing on your Spin-Off page, specifically about COVID. Your latest article, New Zealand's COVID-19 vaccine purchase agreement explained, which I think we might have talked a little bit about tonight as well. And it's been an absolute blast. Siouxsie Wiles, you're a national treasure. And thank you for joining us tonight. It's been really informative. I've learned stuff, and I hope other people have too, but it's just been lovely to meet, lovely to chat, and thanks for everything you're doing.
Oh, my pleasure. And thank you so much for the invitation to chat.